insights of recent South Asian history or India, how quickly, in a very detailed way, the entire process through which this investigation process took place. By doing that, he is able to show the discrepancy between the testimonies, the trials, and the conclusion in that report that in the end concludes and exonerates Modi, whereas ironically the evidence which is within the report, which is submitted to the Supreme Court, has all kinds of data which holds him culpable, or his government culpable. How does that work? How is that possible, and why is that so much, despite the fact that he's become a national figure at that time and a candidate for the prime ministership, this fact did not stop more journalists, more investigative journalists to dig into that. And here we're talking about a question of power, which is not necessarily a power that is held at the barrel of necessarily coercion, but how media and often is also vulnerable to domain of influence, corporate interests, business interests. We've seen that happen in the United States in many, many instances, where what is newsworthy and what is not is decided by who. And this is one of the major questions that Mr. Mitta is going to be raising, that riot that resulted in the death of 1,000 innocent people on the streets under the watch of a chief minister, and how quickly that just has become an inconvenient fact rather than something to address and ask and to seek accountability. So with that in mind, and with much great appreciation, I'd like to call on Manoj Mitta to give us a little brief segue into to tell us more about the book and give us a lecture on the fictions of fact-finding.
The fiction of fact-finding. I find the architecture of this room a little awkward. Should I be here or there? I noticed that you were there. So is that where you would like me to be?
I think maybe if you have a smaller group, if all of us can be in one area.
Whatever is convenient.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, so how would you like me to?
It's up to you. If you feel more comfortable, you can be here. Yes.
You can pull up a chair if you want.
If you like to sit, you can also have a chair behind. We can just have a conversation.
Because I may not be as brief as you said I would be. So
yeah. I was going to be the one. It's supposed to be brief and it took some time.
Yeah. Okay. This is the book Mubashir was just now talking about, The Fiction of Fact-Finding. It was published in February 2014 in the run-up to the elections that saw the elevation of Narendra Modi to the office of Prime Minister. Now this book, therefore, as he said, should have received a great deal of interest and curiosity and controversy because it is questioning the exoneration of the man who went on to become Prime Minister of India. Yet there was a reluctance on the part of media organizations to engage with it. They had the option of trashing it, tearing it apart, critiquing it and saying, in what way, different ways is it flawed. But they did not dare do anything like that. And that is because of the methodology I adopted, which Mubashir referred to, which is that I did not do any parallel investigation to say that, look, what, incidentally, it's a measure of how influential has this official narrative been, that even when Mubashir was introducing the subject, he fell prey to the propaganda that Modi was exonerated by the Supreme Court. He wasn't. This was actually exoneration by an investigating agency appointed by the Supreme Court, namely Special Investigation Team. And why was it appointed in the first place? Because the regular mechanism that was available in the state of Gujarat was found by the Supreme Court to be utterly compromised, incapable of doing justice, incapable of doing any credible investigation, which was the reason why they resorted to this extraordinary mechanism of a special investigation team, which comprised some serving officers of the Gujarat police and some retired officers from Delhi, from the center, from Central Bureau of Investigation, which is the rough equivalent of FBI, right? Now, this exoneration was by the SIT, and instead of filing what we call in our system as a charge sheet, at the end of the investigation, the investigating agency has the option of either filing a charge sheet if the investigation bears out the allegations that were made initially, and if the evidence supports the initial allegations, then the investigating agency has the option of filing what we in India call charge sheet. Alternatively, if the investigation shows that the allegations were baseless, then it has the option of filing what we call a closure report. Now, this special investigation team set up by the Supreme Court filed a closure report in Modi's case. And that closure report is filed in a criminal court, which is way down in the hierarchy. As it happens, it was filed in the Magistrates Court of Ahmedabad. Magistrate is the lowest layer of the judiciary. And that magistrate in December 2013, that is about 6 months before the elections, he passed an order upholding the SIT's closure report and rejecting the protest petition filed by the complainant, Zakia Jafri, who is one of the victims of the Gujarat 2002 carnage. And as we speak, there is an appeal pending against the magistrate's order before the Gujarat High Court, which is a state provincial court, the highest court in that province, but it has not yet come to the Supreme Court. I am making this point just to say that it has not yet been adjudicated upon, it has not yet, the allegations have not yet been discussed before any bench of the Supreme Court. They have not yet had an occasion to pronounce on the guilt or innocence of Narendra Modi. So whatever has happened so far is the doing of an investigating agency which was in the first place set up because Gujarat police was found to be completely incapable of dealing with it in the normal course, and the lowest level of the judiciary, Magistrates Court, had upheld it, and right now, even as we speak, it's a matter pending before the Gujarat High Court. Now, I also did a book on the 1984 carnage. Now, these two books relate to what are seen in India as the two most epochal or seminal events as far as mass violence, impunity for mass violence are concerned. As Mubashir said, this was the last big carnage that took place in India. Over 1,000 people were killed following an incident in which a train was burned in a place called Godhra. And this was supposed to be retaliatory violence targeting Muslims because Hindus were killed in that train burning incident. About 58 people, 59 altogether. And from the very next day, there was violence unleashed by Hindu right-wing groups, which are loosely called Sangh Parivar, RSS, BJP. I don't know if these names mean anything to you, right? So VHP, Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and so on. So now, prior to that, way back in 1984, there was another such carnage. In fact, this was on an even larger scale. This this was probably even more shocking for the reason that it was almost entirely one-sided, and for the reason that it took place right in the capital of the country. I mean, the violence was had spread to other places too, but the epicenter, the highest number of killings were right in the capital, right under the nose of the central government, as we call it. Right? And for 3 long days, there was nothing like law and order machinery. There was no evidence of state on the streets. Mobs were allowed to have a free run, and at the few places where police were visible, they either looked the other way or in some instance even aided these mobs. Now, this book and this one, as I said, I happen to write, and it's a commentary on the documentation culture or the lack of it in India. That I'm the only one to have written books on these two big instances of mass violence and impunity for mass violence. And what is even more telling is the first book, when I finally could do it, along with H.S. Pulka, who is the face of the campaign for justice, an attorney based in Delhi, who's been crusading for justice on behalf of victims. He and I, it took us this long to put together this material. Like with this book is essentially based on official fact-finding. What is it that tells us about their own findings? You know, we linked the dots, and there were a whole lot of admissions made by various official fact-finding agencies. But the whole process was for many years kept under wraps. It was only because there was a change of government and there was a fresh inquiry that had been ordered that led to the disclosure of a lot of these old fact-finding reports. They entered the public domain, and we came out with this book in the year 2007, which is full 23 years after the incident. And this was the first book on the subject, the first book critiquing the fact-finding and so on. Why I mention it is because the scale of the violence is so huge that if I were to tell you that the official death toll itself was as high as 2,733 in Delhi alone. You can imagine, what kind of a culture, legal culture are we talking about? That something of this magnitude can take place right in the capital of the country, and then there could be so much impunity following it. Impunity means there was no justice. There were all sorts of cover-up done. They went through the motions of initiating legal processes, but they would just maintain that pretense, that myth of something being done, but ultimately nothing would come out. So at the end of these 30 years, what do we have? The number of convictions for murder for this 2,733 is no more than just 30 in 30 years, in about a dozen cases. So it was as bad as that. Now, I will try and tell you, both these incidents, if I were to talk about, they would involve a whole lot of complex sets of facts that I will have to wade through. And in this brief presentation, I won't be able to do justice to it. So what I'll try and do is tell you a couple of stories about both these instances, drawing parallels between them, and hopefully that will give you a sense of what happened. First is the story of two speeches, a tale of two speeches, and the other is a tale of two inquiries. The tale of two speeches is about political complicity, and a tale of two inquiries is about the cover. Now, this book, When a Tree Shook Delhi, the title is inspired by a very infamous observation made by the then Prime Minister of India, Rajiv Gandhi, when within a fortnight of the carnage, at his very first public meeting, he said something which sounded as a justification for the violence that had taken place. He said, when a big tree falls, he was referring to the incident that triggered the 1984 carnage, which was the assassination of his mother, who was the Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, by a couple of Sikh bodyguards. And that is what led to these retaliatory killings targeting Sikhs the following 3 days. So he said, when a big tree falls, the earth is bound to shake. Now, when these words were uttered and they were highlighted in the media, it was quite possible, as a journalist, I'm very conscious of the fact that sometimes we pick up some line out of context, or we might highlight something which is not necessarily representative of the spirit of his speech. We are often unfair to the subject of our discussion or our articles. So when I was doing this book, I took care to see the original manuscript of that speech. I didn't have to look very far, because being the first speech that he delivered as Prime Minister, this speech is reproduced in full in a compilation of his speeches by the Government of India. And because it was the first speech, this is right at the beginning of that. This is the very first speech that is there in that book. And when you look at that speech, it's almost a surreal experience, because you will not get a sense of it being a speech that was delivered in a city that had just seen such a humongous scale of violence. It was barely a fortnight later, thousands of people had been killed, rendered homeless, they turned orphans, had been raped, permanently incapacitated. They were all in a state of shock, trauma. The fire hadn't died down yet. At a time like that, he is delivering this speech, and that entire speech, it turns out, to my surprise, to be something that could very well be represented by that infamous line of his, when a big tree falls, the earth is bound to shake. Because that whole speech was a very brazen attempt on his part to reach out to the crowd in front of him, and the thrust of his speech was that I empathize with your anger. He uses this term in Hindi, krodh, which means intense anger. And I congratulate you for getting over that anger in a span of 3 days and showing to the world what a vibrant democracy we are. It was all about, you and I understand, I've shared that anger and whatever you went through. Fine, that was a reality. But how about, sparing a thought for the thousands of innocent people who had been killed, while these people were giving vent to their anger in that very misguided manner? Would you not expect the Prime Minister of India to talk about that as well? But it was so, it's so shocking. It's there in print. It's there for everybody to see. There is not a word, I'm not making this up, there is not a word of concern for Sikhs, for those people who had been killed. And that set the tone for the election campaign, because his whole campaign that followed, within 2 months of the carnage, there was an election to the it was a national election to Lok Sabha, as we call it, and he went on to win the biggest ever mandate, over 400 seats in a house of 540 seats. Nobody before or after won that kind of mandate, and that was a culmination of a campaign in which he was whipping up this anti-Sikh sentiment, portraying them as, people who are out to break the nation, and how his party and he were the sole guarantors of the integrity of the country. And in that environment, people voted with their feet for that party. And after it came to power, in the very first month, in January 1985, when the new parliament meets, one of the first things they do is to pass a resolution condoling Indira Gandhi's assassination. Again, it's something that nobody can object to. But then how about making a similar gesture to commemorate the deaths of thousands of innocent people who had been killed to avenge her death? Again, no. There was nothing about those deaths. It was as blatant as that. And the fact that they were expressly, deliberately excluded from any expression of sympathy from the highest legislature in the country was evident from the fact that around the same time there was a resolution condoling the deaths of victims of Bhopal gas tragedy. I don't know if you remember, there was within a month of this Delhi carnage was this worst ever industrial disaster in a plant set up by an American multinational. And rightly there was a condolence, there was a resolution condoling their death, but nothing about these people. So that was in keeping with the speech in which he said what sounded rightly so then and what my research shows to be indeed a justification of the carnage. Now, I am comparing that speech of Rajiv Gandhi, which he delivered on November 19, 1984. It was on, incidentally, the birth anniversary of Indira Gandhi. That was why he was talking in that manner, all about Indira Gandhi and nothing about Sikhs. I mean, that's the excuse that people of his party give. And I pointed that out, that in his first speech as Prime Minister, how come he talked only about the incident that triggered the carnage, but nothing about the carnage itself, nothing about the thousands who had, innocent people who had been killed. Now that's the justification they give. Now I'm comparing that November 19, 1984 speech of Rajiv Gandhi with a speech delivered by Narendra Modi, the current Prime Minister of India, on February 28, 2002. That was the day on which the post-Godhra violence, as we call it, started. Post-Godhra, because as I said a while ago, there was a train burning incident which took place in a small town called Godhra. Right? Now, when that incident took place, his initial reaction on February 27, 2002 was, okay, that was a very shocking incident and nothing could be said about what is responsible for it till the police do their investigation. This is what he said from the capital of Gujarat, Gandhinagar. He had just been elected to the Gujarat legislature a week prior to Godhra incident. That was the first time he ever contested in an election, and he won from a seat that had just been vacated for him by a legislator from his party because it was considered to be a safe seat. That particular legislator had won with a massive majority. So he vacated it for this chief minister, and one would have expected the chief minister, because he is an incumbent, to win with an even greater margin, right, from this very safe constituency for his party. But what happened in reality was that Narendra Modi won with a reduced margin, with a much reduced margin. I mentioned this to say that a week prior to Godhra, Modi was just one of the many leaders of Bharatiya Janata Party. In his own state, when he contested as a sitting chief minister, he barely won that election, right? But come Godhra and come post-Godhra violence, I mean, there's a dramatic change in his fortunes. There's suddenly a whole new constituency that he develops overnight, not just in his state but across the country. And that there was no looking back for him. He rose from strength to strength and finally went on to become the Prime Minister of India. So Godhra was the turning point in his life. Now, how did it all happen? When he went to Godhra that evening, that's when his association with this big right-wing constituency began. Because as he landed in Godhra, he was heckled by people of his ideology and said, look, something like this happened in your rule, and it's something that it recalls for very severe retaliation. And his whole approach changes, because he then says, he publicly says to the press that what happened at Godhra was no less than a terror attack. It was the result of a premeditated conspiracy, and blah blah blah. Now, what happened at Godhra had all the makings of, all the appearances of a riot. There was no sign of any firearms used, no explosives used. This happened just 4 months after 9/11. There was no aircraft used. And this happened just 2 months after Indian Parliament was attacked, in a terror crime. That again had the makings of a terror crime. A group of militants drove into Parliament premises, armed to their teeth with explosives in that car. Right? This had nothing like that. The weapons that were used were stones, sticks, and stuff like that. And as we speak in 2004, we have the benefit of a judgment of the Godhra incident. The judgment says, the trial court judgment says that, these group of Hindu pilgrims, car sevaks as they are called, they were in a very belligerent mood as they were coming from a campaign in a place called Ayodhya, where years earlier Muslim mosque had been demolished, and they were part of this campaign to build a mosque, build a temple in the place of that mosque in the holy city of Ayodhya. So they were coming back with all these, raising these belligerent slogans, anti-Muslim slogans, and misbehaving with Muslims along the way. And when they did something similar in this place, Godhra, which happened to be right next to a Muslim area, there was a response, retaliation from Muslim vendors and the residents of that area. The judgment goes on to say that these pilgrims attacked these Muslim vendors and were forcing them to raise Hindu slogans, Jai Sri Ram and so on and so forth. They refused to pay them for tea or snacks that they had. And the judgment goes on to even say that one Muslim woman was molested. So that led to this kind of stone pelting. And in the course of that stone pelting, about a kilometer after the train left the station, it stopped and then it caught fire. Now, on that day, there was no signs of it being terror crime, but Modi went on to say that, and that added fuel to the fire, that escalated communal tensions, and sure enough, the next morning, violence began. And in the course of that day, on February 28th, in the evening, he delivers this speech, which I'm comparing Rajiv Gandhi's speech with. This speech of Modi was actually not at a public meeting, unlike Rajiv Gandhi's. It was actually a peace appeal that was recorded by a state-run television channel, Doordarshan. And the similarity with Rajiv Gandhi's speech is that here again, Modi's peace appeal was focused entirely on the triggering incident, that is Godhra. He is expressing a great deal of outrage over what happened at Godhra and says that now we need to teach them a lesson that they would not even in their dreams forget, and he would use that kind of language, and they would not be, the culprits would not be spared, and so on and so forth. Condemns it in no uncertain terms. But much like Rajiv Gandhi, he's completely silent about a whole lot of people of the other community, that is, in this instance, it was Muslims. If Sikhs were targeted in 84, in 2002 it was Muslims, the biggest minority community in India. Now, by the time he recorded this speech, this peace appeal on the evening of 28 February, many more Muslims had been killed in those retaliatory in the retaliatory violence of that day. The first big massacre at Gulberg Society had already taken place at 3 o'clock. This peace appeal was recorded before Doordarshan, the state-run TV channel, at 6 o'clock. And there was another big massacre. In fact, the biggest massacre of 2002 carnage was at Naroda Patya. At Gulberg Society, the death toll was 69. At Godhra, the death toll was 59. So there were more people in Gulberg Society. And at Naroda Patya, the death toll is 96. And there was another place, Naroda Gam, about 11 people. So there were several places Ahmedabad that had gone up in flames, where there was a lot of violence going on. Now, so what does he say about that? He still talks about it as a danger, there is a danger of retaliatory violence. So he is mildly chiding Hindus. He is telling them to observe peace, not to give in to emotions, help the government maintain peace, observe, he tells them, observe restraint and so on and so forth. Now that was a very strange thing for him to say, because when the speech was, when that peace appeal was broadcast soon after that, and it was repeatedly broadcast during that next few days as a peace appeal, but it could be read actually as a very blatant instance of discrimination, because it was, people could see that though this peace appeal was delivered on the evening of February 28, by which time so many Muslims had been killed, he is not acknowledging those killings at all. He is only he is only railing against Muslims for what they had done allegedly done at Godhra, but nothing about the retaliatory killings of Muslims in the post-Godhra violence. So this is the two speeches, therefore I found to be comparable in that sense. Now I come to the tale of two inquiries. Now if you go back to 1984, as I said, Rajiv Gandhi made no secret of his hostility to rendering any justice to the victims of 84, right from the manner in which he spoke on his mother's birthday, when he delivered that first public meeting of his, when he delivered that first public speech of his. Now, whenever he was asked during that campaign about holding an inquiry into that big carnage, thousands of people killed, so there should be an inquiry, he would every time say, react negatively to it, very dismissive of that demand, and say, no, it's only going to reopen old wounds, it's only going to inflame passions. He was on this whole theme of moving on. And the media, the society at large seemed to have, bought into that rhetoric of his. They went on to see him as a harbinger of change, as somebody who was going to take India into the 21st century. They could not see the fact that he had blood on his hands, and that he was refusing to hold an inquiry to shield people of his party or his supporters who had taken law into their hands. But that's not how it was perceived then. But ultimately, about 6 months later, he was forced to order an inquiry, and that was because of an administrative exigency. Namely, that the state of Punjab had been going through insurgency for a long time, and in fact, his mother's assassination and the carnage that followed were all offshoots of that Punjab insurgency. So he had to address it as the Prime Minister, and the largest party of Punjab, Akali Dal, representing Sikh interest, their leaders were all in jail at that time, following army's invasion of Golden Temple in Amritsar. So the then leader, the foremost leader of Akali Dal was Sant Longowal. Now he made it clear to Rajiv Gandhi's emissaries that he would not enter into any talks with the government regarding Punjab situation until they make this gesture of goodwill, of appointing, of a gesture of showing their genuineness by appointing an inquiry into the 84 carnage. So he insisted upon it as a precondition to holding talks. And it was in those circumstances that Rajiv Gandhi finally appointed an inquiry. Now, just as the legislature towed the executive line by not making the gesture of having a resolution condoling the victims of the 1984 carnage, now we see an instance of the judiciary towing the executive's line. I mean, here is an instance of a post-colonial state devouring its own citizens And the judiciary, rather than serving as a safeguard, rather than serving as a check on administrative excesses, it, it is complicit in a cover-up. How do I say that? The inquiry was headed by a sitting Supreme Court judge, Ranganath Mishra. And from the beginning of that inquiry, the proceedings were all in camera. It means that when witnesses and victims were giving their testimonies before that commission, no member of the public, no member of the media were allowed to sit in the courtroom. Only counsel representing the victims were allowed. What was worse was when there were a few state actors who were who gave their testimonies. Even the counsel for victims were not allowed. In fact, there was an organization that was set up then called Citizens Justice Committee, consisting of headed by a former Chief Justice of India, S.M. Sikri, and it had big human rights champions like V.M. Tarkunde, Sori Sorabji, Rajni Kothari. These are all legendary figures in India. They then staged a walkout of the inquiry. What prompted them to do so? Because at some point they filed an application before the commission saying, look, you've so far been recording testimonies of only of victims and witnesses. How about calling some of these state actors, like say the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi, the Police Commissioner of Delhi, or the General Officer Commanding of the Army who was engaged in army operations during the carnage. It was on their watch that this violence had taken place. They have much to answer for. They would be able to shed light on what exactly happened. So we need to call them, put them in the witness box, and they need to be subjected to cross-examination. So when they made that application, Mishra very blithely said, oh no, don't worry, I've already recorded their testimonies. And that came as a shock to them, which meant that this man had recorded testimonies which were untested by any kind of cross-examination. Now, in any jurisdiction which pretends to have respect the rule of law, would not take an untested testimony as credible evidence. You can't have a situation where somebody can claim anything, any self-serving statements he can make, and that is taken as evidence by a commission or by a court, right? The witness has to be subjected to cross-examination by the other side, and it is only if whatever survives of that from the cross-examination will be taken as evidence. But that was not allowed. So this is the way in which this inquiry was conducted, and the Citizens Justice Committee withdrew from it because they didn't want to lend any further legitimacy to this with their participation. And when the report finally came out, it was no surprise that it was just a whitewash of what happened in '84. It exonerated the ruling party, it exonerated the government, the Rajiv Gandhi regime, and so on and so forth. But then it was such a tenuous report, its findings were so fragile, it could not be exposed to any kind of discussion in Parliament. So again, now the legislature was toward the government line, and the presiding officers of the two houses of Parliament did not allow any discussion on the subject. The government used its brute majority to gag the opposition. So there was no discussion whatsoever. It was only much later when I mentioned a while ago how there was an altogether new inquiry that was held to undo the mischief of the earlier one, post-2000. So when that new inquiry, which was headed by another Supreme Court judge, G.T. Nanavati, when Nanavati Commission did its inquiry, by then, many of these players had died. Rajiv Gandhi was long dead, and H.K.L. Bhagat, who was the MP from East Delhi, which had places like Trilokpuri, which was the worst affected area. And Trilokpuri is back in news. Those of you who follow news would know. On Diwali, there was a fresh eruption of violence. Just on the eve of what is indeed the 30th anniversary of the 1984 carnage, right? So this man was on his deathbed, H.K.L. Bhagat. So this Nanavati's inquiry was about lesser lights like Jagdish Tytler, who happened to be a minister at that time in the government of Manmohan Singh, the Congress-led coalition. In 2005, when this report was submitted, Congress was back in power, but they did not have the majority, the power that they had in '84. They were now part of a coalition government. Yet, when Nanavati Commission indicted Jagdish Tytler, who was a minister, and Sajjan Kumar, a Congress MP, the Manmohan Singh government had the gumption to reject these findings in the first instance. They came out with an action taken report in Parliament saying, no, we are not accepting any of these recommendations. But as it happened, in the changed circumstances, it was not just the opposition that attacked the government, even allies like the left parties, Samajwadi Party, they all attacked the government. And within 2 days, Manmohan Singh government had to make a U-turn and take action against these people, in the sense that Jagdish Tytler was forced to resign from the government, and Sajjan Kumar was forced to resign from a post he was holding in the Delhi administration. And that was when, for the first time in 21 years, there was a discussion on the 1984 carnage. I went into this background to tell you, the trajectory of inquiry or accountability processes in India, the world's largest democracy, but it takes 21 years for a big carnage like this that takes place right in the capital, 21 years for that carnage to be discussed in Parliament. And that was when Manmohan Singh went on to tender an apology to the nation, to the Sikh community, and said, that such an incident should not have happened. So this is as far as the inquiry into 84 was concerned. Now I was comparing that with the inquiry into 2002. In a bizarre coincidence, Narendra Modi appointed the same judge, G.T. Nanavati, to inquire into 2002 carnage as well. There was a time when Nanavati was holding inquiries into 84 carnage as well as 2002 carnage. But then, while he was wearing these two hats, he could not have been more different. Because when it came to 84, his brief was to undo the mischief played by Ranganath Mishra. So he was holding it all, in public. He made, he put a whole lot of material out in the public domain, which allowed us to do this book. But when it came to 2002, he was behaving more like Ranganath Mishra did in 80s, and he was absolutely refusing to call Narendra Modi as a witness. He was refusing to summon him to ask, give his defense or give his explanation for all the allegations that were made against him. And this is despite the fact that after there was a change of regime in 2004 at the center, the terms of reference of Nanavati Commission were changed by Modi to bring himself expressly under the ambit of this inquiry. Why did he do so? Because he didn't want to take a chance with the central government. Now that Congress was ruling the center, he didn't want them to set up a parallel inquiry and put him in the dock. So to preempt them, the terms of reference of Nanavati Commission were changed to say that it is meant to look at allegations against the chief minister, ministers, bureaucrats, and so on. So even after the terms of reference expressly said that you have to look at the allegations against the chief minister, to date, he hasn't done so. Why do I say to date? Because even after 12 years, the Nanavati Commission is still holding its proceedings. This is another farcical aspect of it. I mean, the way farce is displayed would be different. So in the case of 2002, what he has done was, he's been getting extension after extension. Over 20 odd extensions he has received. And even as we speak, he is still holding an inquiry into the 2002 carnage. But the saving grace is that when it came to the police investigations, as I said, they were found to be very compromised. There were a whole lot of acquittals that took place, as was the case with 84 carnage too, or so many carnages. There was only impunity when it comes to mass violence in India. So 2002 was no exception. But then, when it came to one very high-profile case called Best Bakery case, I don't know if this name rings a bell. When Best Bakery case judgment came, there was an institution called National Human Rights Commission, an institution which did not exist in the case of 84 because it came into being only in 93. So things had changed. In 2002, civil society was more assertive. The media was also better endowed in terms of there being 24/7 private TV channels. So there was a lot more information available, and this particular case had already been highlighted by National Human Rights Commission when they conducted a spot inquiry immediately after the carnage. So this was among the cases that they said required special attention. So when this went to the Supreme Court and said, you need to intervene, Supreme Court said, no, let the High Court take corrective action. But as it happened, the High Court upheld the acquittals in the Best Bakery case, and that was when, finally, in the year 2004, the Supreme Court bench headed by Justice Pasai came out with this path-breaking judgment, which led to the case being transferred out of Gujarat. They said, we will order a fresh trial into this case, and that fresh trial or retrial will be held outside Gujarat in Bombay. So this was a slap on the face of the Modi regime and the police system there, the criminal justice system there, the courts there, because Supreme Court passed such an order after the trial court and the High Court had exonerated all these people. And there was a tacit suggestion on the part of the Supreme Court that there was such a complete breakdown of systems in Gujarat that we are taking this unprecedented step of transferring this case for a fresh retrial. And this was followed by another case, Bilkis Banu. It's a gang rape and multiple murders of her family members. In this case, Gujarat police did not even let it go to the stage of trial. It filed a closure report. So when the matter was highlighted by the NHRC, the Supreme Court went further than it did in Best Bakery. In Best Bakery, they ordered a fresh retrial. In the case of Bilkis Banu, they ordered a fresh investigation. They referred Bilkis Banu case to the CBI, the central agency. A fresh investigation was held, and a trial was held outside Gujarat, and that led to convictions. So it was felt that maybe this would be the template for whatever action the Supreme Court would order for some 9 egregious cases, including say Godhra or Gulbarg Society or Naroda Patia, these big well-known cases, which are all stayed by the Supreme Court, the trial. And but finally what the Supreme Court did was it referred them not to CBI but to this special investigation team that I referred to, that I mentioned a while ago. The special investigation team was entrusted with the investigation of these 9 cases, and some of them led to convictions. The best known being from Naroda Patia, where a minister, Maya Kodnani, who was ironically Minister for Women and Child Development in Modi's government, she was convicted for masterminding Naroda Patia, the biggest killings in 2002. And but then, when it came to the crunch, when it came to probing investigations against Modi himself, the SIT completely failed to deliver. The occasion for investigating allegations against Modi arose because of a complaint filed by Zakia Jafri, as I mentioned a while ago. The Supreme Court referred Zakia Jafri's complaint also to the SIT. And this complaint said that, while there are investigations going into individual massacres, there is a need to probe the larger conspiracy, the conspiracy at the highest level in the state, which allowed so many massacres to take place for so long. And she listed out some 63 accused persons, and accused number 1 in that complaint was Narendra Modi. And because it was an inquiry ordered by the Supreme Court and it was being monitored by the Supreme Court, the SIT had no option but to call Modi to answer questions. That was how in the year 2010, for the first time, although as I said a while ago, this man Nanavati had repeatedly refused to call Modi, the SIT did not have the option of avoiding Modi. They finally interrogated Modi. So they put some 70 odd questions spread over 8-9 hours. On the face of it, it seemed like he was very rigorously questioned, but a closer scrutiny would show that all that the investigator did was covered various aspects that were mentioned in the in Zakir Jafri's complaint, but at no point were any of the claims made by Modi challenged. There was no attempt on the part of the investigator to pin down Modi on any of the evasive answers he was giving or any of the contradictory answers he was giving. Now, I'll give one simple example to highlight what I'm saying, and I will close after that. That example is a very simple question he was asked. When did you come to know of Gulbarga Society massacre? As I said, Gulbarga Society was the first post-Godhra massacre, which took place on the afternoon of February 28th, right? And Naroda Patia massacres also took place at the same time, in the course of the same week. So he was asked, when did you come to know about these two massacres? And Modi says that he came to know about it at a meeting that was held on the evening of that day at his residence. And elsewhere in the report, SIT, while giving a detailed account of all the activities of Modi, said that this meeting was held at 8:30 in Chief Minister's house in Gandhinagar, right? So effectively, what is being suggested there and what remained unchallenged completely by the SIT was that Modi is claiming that Gulbarga Society massacre took place at the Gulbarga Society massacre, which took place at 3 o'clock, and it was all over by 3:45. 69 people, including a former Congress MP, Ahsan Jafri, were killed in that massacre. Right? He is unaware of it. He had no clue to it till 8:30 in the night, till he was told about it by police officers. And not just about this, but about Naroda Patia as well. Right? Now, this was completely at odds with another claim he made in the course of that interrogation, and for which he received much praise from the SIT. The SIT gave him credit for having tracked the violence on a real-time basis, because Modi was not just the chief minister, but he was also the home minister of Gujarat, meaning he was directly in charge of law and order. So he was seen to be on the ball in holding a series of meetings with senior police officers and officials of the Home Department, and that series of meetings were duly recorded in the SIT report. And one such meeting took place at 4 o'clock, that is within minutes of the SIT, within minutes of the Gulbarga Society massacre concluding. That massacre was over by 3:45. The police had arrived at Gulbarga Society by then. And just 3 kilometers from there, at a place called Circuit House Annexi in Ahmedabad, Modi was holding a meeting to review the law and order situation with the Home Department officials. And that meeting took place from 4 to 4:30. And from 4:30 to 5:45, at the same venue, he holds a press conference. How do we know all these details with such precision? Because it's all spelled out in the SIT report, right? While commending him for taking all these measures to control violence, right? He did everything that could have been done. That was the point that SIT was trying to make. That was the defense he made, and SIT fully accepted that claim. But the problem is, it was completely contradictory to his claim that though he was tracking the violence on a real-time basis, holding the series of meetings, he was unaware of the Gulbarga Society massacre and Naroda Patia massacre till 8:30 in the night. How is that possible? If he was getting feedback from senior police officers, if they were reporting to him, as was being suggested in one context by the SIT, in another context, the SIT has no problems in accepting his claim that he did not know about it. He was in the dark till 8:30. This contradiction is something that could not have missed anybody's notice. If it did, it meant that SIT was simply unwilling to bring out the truth, because this contradiction showed that Modi was clearly hiding something, was hiding evidence of his complicity. Because if he was holding these series of meetings, he would have been getting reports. Because that same SIT report says that this Gulbarga Society massacre was preceded by hours of siege since morning. And the police that were present there were repeatedly sending messages for reinforcements. All that was going to the senior police officers. And at one point, a senior police officer went to Gulbarga Society at 12 o'clock, opened fire, fired in the air, dispersed the crowd, and he went away from there because he felt that he needed to be elsewhere at that time. And in no time, the mob regrouped and then went on to, stage that massacre, right? So the police were aware of what was happening, and the police were reporting to Modi, and yet Modi says he didn't know. So the two reasons why he feigned ignorance could be, one, his inaction in intervening at Gulbarga Society and Naroda Patia, and his failure to take cognizance of these killings in his peace appeal that was recorded at 6 o'clock. To cover up for these two inconvenient, very damning facts, he claimed that, I didn't know about it till 8:30. And SIT allowed him to get away with that claim, although he was, as I said, in a different context saying, I was completely on the ball, tracking the violence on a real-time basis. So that was the reason why, when I did this book, I gave it this oxymoronic title, The Fiction of Fact-Finding. Because if the SIT was earnest about the responsibility of finding facts about Gujarat 2002, if it had done it with any modicum of integrity, then it is very probable that Modi would have been indicted by the SIT and he would have been facing a trial. And had he been indicted, it is unlikely that he would have been made the prime ministerial candidate of BJP, and it's unlikely, even more unlikely, that he would have become the prime minister of India. Right? So instead of being the prime minister, he would have been facing trial had the SIT not indulged in this fiction of fact-finding. And on this note, let me end. And if there are any questions, I'll be glad to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
My name is Yash. I'm from Delhi. I'm a second year student over there. I wanted to ask that we spoke about has he been counter questioned on what contrast that there was a meeting at 4 and he only got to know at 8 and he made that statement. Has he been asked further questions on this?
That is exactly the point I was making, that there were no follow-up questions. It was as if the investigator had a predetermined set of questions and he is just running through those questions. Irrespective of the answers Modi is giving, he would go on to the next question without asking him, hey, hang on. If how could you say that you did not know about it till 8:30 in the night? That's a logical question anybody who was seeking to find out truth would have put. But no, he didn't ask. So since he didn't ask, in the SIT report there's no mention of this contradiction at all. So very important pieces of evidence fell through the cracks because of this shoddy fact-finding. That's the point I was trying to bring out in my book.
Sorry, one follow-up. Have any Amit Shah types approached you?
Sorry?
Like people like Amit Shah and like Modi, cronies try to approach you, and what has been the governmental response to the book?
Well, there's been no response from the government.
Yeah. Or the lack of it.
I think, there are two reasons why I think, the media, more than the government, I would have expected the media, which is so invested in this rhetoric of his being the answer to India's development needs and so on and so forth. I would have thought that, these people who were writing articles on Modi, who were interviewing Modi, should have taken cognizance of the truth about the inquiry that was held. They were instead only too happy to go by the conclusions. They were saying it is enough for us that a Supreme Court appointed SIT has exonerated him. It's because it suits their politics. It's because it suits the interests of the corporate sector, which have been backing this man's conservative policies, right-wing, not just economically but also socially. So they couldn't care less that he had blood on his hands. They were all, just as in '84, let's move on was the guiding philosophy. We see much of that happening in 2002 as well. In fact, I'm of the view, having followed issues of mass violence right from '80s, that had there been a proper follow-up action on '84, it's not just 2002. There were so many there were so many instances of violence in '80s itself. Bhagalpur riots, then destruction of Babri Masjid, followed by Bombay riots and so on and so forth, leading up to this Gujarat violence. All these would have probably been averted if there was proper accountability for '84. Since there was so much impunity for '84, and on the other hand, there was evidence of the perpetrators of '84 benefiting politically, reaping an electoral harvest from that bloodshed. That became an incentive, a very perverse incentive in Indian democracy. We saw that happening over and over again. And that is what happened even in 2004. Whoever was perceived to be behind the violence is rewarded electorally. It happened in the context of Muzaffarnagar violence. That's how BJP went on to sweep Uttar Pradesh in the 2014 elections, exceeding their own expectations. And it is feared that today, if a place like Trilokpuri is now in the grip of communal violence, it is because it is again helping BJP polarize, the voters, create that insecurity. So it's happening over and over again. We have not been able to break out of this cycle because the legal action had not been taken because of this impunity. Sure.
So just wanted to, a couple of observations I was taking some notes. One is that, there was a Congress-ruled government, so the investigation agencies were, and Congress had in its interest to ensure that Modi did not come up to the center. So these were not as though there was a BJP government in power, and there was a Congress, in power that was very hostile to Mr. Modi. So that was at the time of the investigation. And so the second is that you said that
Now, what is the question about?
The second is the corporate sector. You said the corporate sector, as though the election.
Before you come to the second question, will you tell me what the first question was?
I'm just
Okay.
observation of you spoke about the corporate sector having, so it seemed your statement that as though the corporate sector brought Modi to power in India, but he was brought, or the current coalition was brought by a large, it was against the economic policies of the Congress government and not by the corporate sector. Like he was not elected by the corporate sector. Observation.
Well, we are now getting into a political discussion which is not strictly about the fact-finding here, right? Which was the thrust of my work, right? As far as the role of corporate sector is concerned, the fact that any number of corporate bigwigs coming out in support of Modi well before the elections took place is an open secret. I mean, they said that in public, right? And in this election, BJP raised much more money than Congress got from corporate people. And the fact that Congress also paid for its misrule and for the series of scams and for its policy paralysis is, it does not detract from this. I mean, there are two different issues. That there is a school of thought which believes that BJP would have anyway emerged as the largest party, if not won majority on its own, irrespective of who was the leader of that party, whether it was Advani who was going to lead BJP or Modi or some other person. It is very likely that in 2014 election, because Congress had already been in power for 2 terms, there was a great deal of anti-incumbency, they had been involved in a series of scams, and economy was in a bad shape, whether it was due to its own misrule or because of larger global factors is another point. But there was a lot of disenchantment about the government at that time. So the situation was very conducive for BJP to come to power, or if not BJP, some third formation. It was very unlikely that Congress would have won a third term in 2014. So, it was at a time like that the corporate sector had very heavily backed BJP and particularly Modi. I mean, there is no uncertainty about that. There is no question about that. The earlier question was, the earlier point you made was that much of these investigations were taking place at a time when Congress was in power at the center. Yeah, that is true. But these are investigations that were being done by the Supreme Court monitored SIT. What is the point you are making? That if there was, indeed any guilt on the part of Modi, why would he have been allowed to get away with it at a time when Congress was in power? Is that your question?
That's the observation that we understand.
Yeah. So I'm therefore trying to address that question of yours. It's not as if this is all the doing of the executive. True, there are instances of police forces or CBI behaving as a caged parrot. That's an expression that not too long ago the Supreme Court used to describe the amount of interference that goes on in police investigations, right? But in the context of Gujarat 2002, whatever justice had taken place, whatever convictions we saw. A while ago I talked about how in the context of 84, there have in these 30 years only been 30 convictions for murder. But in the case of 2002, the number of convictions is estimated to be over 200. Convictions for murder is estimated to be over 200. So there's been a very appreciable improvement in conviction rate. The death toll for 2002 was lesser, but the number of convictions is higher. So in that sense, it is a matter of consolation. Not only have the convictions been higher, number of convictions been higher, we have even succeeded in getting a minister convicted, right? Yes. But this is all thanks to essentially the intervention of the very forceful intervention of the Supreme Court, right? Till it intervened in the Best Bakery case, there was only a succession of acquittals in the Gujarat state, right? After the Supreme Court intervened, some convictions started taking place in Gujarat courts, and a lot of the convictions were on account of the SIT's investigations, which were, as I said, appointed by the Supreme Court itself. So that's why there has been an improvement. Yeah.
You had said that you're one of the only people who's written or published a book on these issues. Why do you think there's a lack of academic research, and do you think it's linked to the investigative inability?
It's not just academic. I mean, at least academics, tend to come into the picture later. I'm more concerned about the first respondents, who are the media. We deal with information on a real-time basis, and we have access to a lot of stuff that goes on. Yet, even when something like this comes out, I mean, just in the run-up to elections, it should have been very newsy because it's about the man who was seen to be the future Prime Minister. There was so much buzz about him, and clearly his rise was linked to his role in the 2002, and his exoneration in 2002 is what led to his party nominating him as Prime Minister. It was no coincidence. Chronologically, that's exactly the order in which it happened. After the SIT exonerated him, Modi became BJP's Prime Ministerial candidate. So that should have been all the more a reason for the media to look closely at that. But if the media did not do so, it was because they were hampered by the corporate driven agenda. The mainstream media is essentially controlled by corporate priorities. So that very clearly comes through. As far as
so essentially, I get the feeling that from this talk that essentially the SIT sort of was there the fear of overreach? What was the irregularities that you point out in the SIT's investigations, or the willingness to turn a blind eye? So,
overreach on whose part?
On the SIT's part. I mean, why this cross-examination, this lack of cross-examination? Why did it happen, you think? What was the reason? Were they sort of afraid that, there might be a backlash?
No, overreach is probably not the word. Overreach would be when they have exceeded their brief, when they have gone out of their brief. No. Here, on the contrary, they have failed to discharge the trust that was reposed in them. They did not live up to that trust. They did a patently dishonest job. So it's not overreach. It's this failure to ask very obvious follow-up questions. That when somebody is giving evasive, contradictory replies, any investigator worth his salt would pin down the witness. If they did not do so, that was dishonesty. And let me mention at this point that this dishonesty is evident in several ways, not just through that one example I cited in this presentation. There were many examples you will find in my book of the SIT's dishonesty. Another example I can cite is that when this SIT was reporting to the Supreme Court, very unfortunately, in a very controversial move, terminated the monitoring very abruptly, very prematurely in retrospect, right? And it was after the Supreme Court terminated the monitoring that the SIT filed its closure report before the magistrate. Now, there are very significant differences between the reports that the SIT gave to the Supreme Court and the closure report that the same SIT gave to the magistrate's court after the Supreme Court's monitoring had concluded. The difference shows that there was a great deal of sanitization on the part of the SIT when it came to filing that closure report. There were instances like, the SIT admitting that Modi, displayed bias in rushing to the Godhra the same day, but when it comes to instances of post-Godhra violence, he took his own sweet time. He took several days to go to those sites or to meet the victims of that carnage, right? Or the post-Godhra carnage. So, the SIT in its report to the Supreme Court concedes that he showed bias there. The SIT also pulled him up, or admitted that, when it comes to some allegations of hate speech, that what Modi said or the manner in which Modi spoke was not appropriate for Chief Minister. He was, sort of making things worse from the point of view of law and order. All that is admitted in its reports to the Supreme Court when the monitoring was going on. But when it comes to the filing this closure report, the Supreme Court did not direct the SIT to file a closure report. The Supreme Court said, okay, you do your investigation properly, and at the end of it, whatever you deem fit, you do. File a closure report if you think no evidence is made out, or file a charge sheet. Now the SIT filed a closure report. And how did it file a closure report? By sanitizing the reports it had given to the Supreme Court. These adverse references that were there before the Supreme Court had all disappeared when it came to the closure report that was filed before the magistrate, there was no reference whatsoever to this admission that they made, that he displayed bias here, or that he did not, he should have observed due restraint in the manner in which he spoke at a sensitive time. He was part of the problem. That's what was virtually admitted by the SIT before the Supreme Court. But when it comes to the closure report before the SIT, before the magistrate, there was no trace of that.
And that's actually my question as to why do you think that happened?
So it's not overreach, it's dishonesty. Why did it happen?
Why the dishonesty?
Why the dishonesty? For that, there are, there's no simple answer for that. I have a whole chapter in my book on the chief of SIT, who was R.K. Raghavan, former chief of CBI. I would urge you to read that chapter, because that will give you an idea of how he is the last person who should have been trusted with such an assignment, because he had much to answer for in the past. He was himself a beneficiary of a very shoddy fact finding, and he should therefore have not been chosen by the Supreme Court in the first place to do to be in charge of such an inquiry. But that's what happened. There were several such reasons.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this, for all you coming out, and thank you for what wonderful questions. Thank you.
Books relate to what are seen in India as the two most epochal or seminal events as far as mass violence, impunity for mass violence are concerned. As Mubashir said, this was the last big carnage that took place in India. Over 1,000 people were killed following an incident in which a train was burned in a place called Godhra. And this was supposed to be retaliatory violence targeting Muslims, because Hindus were killed in that train burning incident. About 58 people, 59 altogether. And from the very next day, there was violence unleashed by Hindu right-wing groups, which are loosely called Sangh Parivar, RSS, BJP. I don't know if these names mean anything to you, right? So VHP, Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and so on. So now, prior to that, way back in 1984, there was another such carnage. In fact, this was on an even larger scale. This was probably even more shocking for the reason that it was almost entirely one-sided, and for the reason that it took place right in the capital of the country. I mean, the violence was had spread to other places too, but the epicenter, the highest number of killings, were right in the capital, right under the nose of the central government, as we call it. Right? And for 3 long days, there was nothing like law and order machinery. There was no evidence of state on the streets. Mobs were allowed to have a free run, and at the few places where police were visible, they either looked the other way or in some instances even aided.
Seek accountability. So with that in mind, and with much great appreciation, I'd like to call on Manoj Mitta to give us a little brief segue into to tell us more about the book and give us a lecture on the fictions of fact-finding.
The fiction of fact-finding. I find the architecture of this room a little awkward. Should I be here or there? I noticed that you were there. So is that where you would like me to be?
I think maybe if you have a smaller group, if all of us can be in one area.
Yeah, whatever is convenient.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, so how would you like me to?
It's up to you. If you feel more comfortable, you can be here. Yes.
You can pull up a chair if you want.
If you like to sit, you can also have a chair behind. We can just have a conversation.
Well, I may not be as brief as you said I would be, so.
I was going to be the one who's supposed to be brief and maybe I took some time.
Okay. This is the book Mubashir was just now talking about, The Fiction of Fact-Finding. It was published in February 2014 in the run-up to the elections that saw the elevation of Narendra Modi to the office of Prime Minister. Now this book, therefore, as he said, should have received a great deal of interest and curiosity and controversy because it is questioning the exoneration of the man who went on to become Prime Minister of India. Yet there was a reluctance on the part of media organizations to engage with it. They had the option of trashing it, tearing it apart, critiquing it and saying, in what way, different ways. The investigation shows that the allegations were baseless. Then it has the option of filing what we call a closure report. Now this special investigation team set up by the Supreme Court filed a closure report in Modi's case. And that closure report is filed in a criminal court, which is way down in the hierarchy. As it happens, it was filed in the Magistrates Court of Ahmedabad. Magistrate is the lowest layer of the judiciary. And that magistrate in December 2013, that is about 6 months before the elections, he passed an order upholding the SIT's closure report and rejecting the protest petition filed by the complainant, Zakia Jafri, who was one of the victims of the Gujarat 2002 carnage. And as we speak, there is an appeal pending against the magistrate's order before the Gujarat High Court, which is a state provincial court, the highest court in that province, but it has not yet come to the Supreme Court. I'm making this point just to say that it has not yet been adjudicated upon, it has not yet, the allegations have not yet been discussed before any bench of the Supreme Court. They have not yet had an occasion to pronounce on the guilt or innocence of Narendra Modi. So whatever has happened so far is the doing of an investigating agency which was in the first place set up because Gujarat police was found to be completely incapable of dealing with it in the normal course, and the lowest level of the judiciary, magistrates court, had upheld it, and right now, even as we speak, it's a matter pending before the Gujarat High Court. Now, I also did a book on the 1984 carnage. Now these two, is it flawed? But they did not dare do anything like that. And that is because of the methodology I adopted, which Mubashir briefly referred to, which is that I did not do any parallel investigation to say that, look, incidentally, it's a measure of how influential has this official narrative been, that even when Mubashir was introducing the subject, he fell prey to the propaganda that Modi was exonerated by the Supreme Court. He wasn't. This was actually exoneration by an investigating agency appointed by the Supreme Court, namely Special Investigation Team. And why was it appointed in the first place? Because the regular mechanism that was available in the state of Gujarat was found by the Supreme Court to be utterly compromised, incapable of doing justice, incapable of doing any credible investigation, which was the reason why they resorted to this extraordinary mechanism of a special investigation team, which comprised some serving officers of the Gujarat police and some retired officers from Delhi, from the center, from Central Bureau of Investigation, which is the rough equivalent of FBI, right? Now, this exoneration was by the SIT, and instead of filing what we call in our system as a charge sheet, at the end of the investigation, the investigating agency has the option of either filing a charge sheet if the investigation bears out the allegations that were made initially, and if the evidence supports the initial allegations, then the investigating agency has the option of filing what we in India call charge sheet. Alternatively, if
Riots of recent South Asian history or India, how quickly, in a very detailed way, the entire process through which this investigation process took place. By doing that, he is able to show the discrepancy between the testimonies, the trials, and the conclusion in that report that in the end concludes and exonerates Modi, whereas ironically the evidence which is within the report, which is submitted to the Supreme Court, has all kinds of data which holds him culpable, or his government culpable. How does that work? How is that possible, and why is that so much, despite the fact that he's become a national figure at that time and a candidate for the prime ministership, this fact did not stop more journalists, more investigative journalists to dig into that. And here we are talking about a question of power, which is not necessarily a power that is held at the barrel of necessarily coercion, but how media and often is also vulnerable to domain of influence, corporate interests, business interests. We've seen that happen in the United States in many, many instances, where what is newsworthy and what is not is decided by who. And this is one of the major questions that Mr. Mitta is going to be raising, that riot that resulted in the death of 1,000 innocent people on the streets under the watch of a chief minister, and how quickly that just become an inconvenient fact rather than something to address and ask and